And the Rio Grande River, as we know, continues on for many miles with its headwaters here in the San Luis Valley and heading on beyond the state border between Colorado and New Mexico. And while there may be people out there that would like to find ways to keep all the water on this side of the state line, we know it continues on into New Mexico and on into Texas and on into the country of Mexico. And so it's very important that we understand how this system does get impacted throughout. And part of that system are also the impacts that happen on an environmental basis, whether it's climate environmental impact, maybe it's habitat environmental impact, species environmental impact. And so today we have with us is Laura Paskus. She's an environmental reporter based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She has worked on several different productions, including a monthly series speaking about our land and New Mexico's environmental past, present, and future. And we are so close to that. We are so close to the New Mexico border that we share a lot of similar traits, a lot of similar issues, a lot of similar heritage. And so, Laura, thank you very much for joining us today. I know this is near and dear to your heart. You definitely enjoy the discussion of the Rio Grande Basin because part of it feeds the lifeblood of where you're at down in New Mexico. So welcome this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, Armando. And thank you to Rio for inviting me to be a part of this. It's kind of funny. I feel like probably most of the people in the audience today already know even better than I do so many of the things I'm going to talk about briefly today. And I know that there are a couple of you out there in the audience who have been sources over the course of my career. So I appreciate all of your expertise and your perspectives. And I'm glad to be here today. So like Armando said, I've been a reporter covering New Mexico's environmental issues and in particular water challenges for 20 years now, which is insane to me. You know, I've seen a lot of changes in that time on the landscape within the banks of the Rio Grande, the river itself changing so much. But I've also seen the conversation shift in many ways toward, at least here in New Mexico, I'm not as familiar with the Colorado side of things, but here in New Mexico, conversations around water are much more collaborative than they were in the late 90s and early 2000s. And there are more people at the there are more stakeholders at the table and more voices included. I would love to see sooner rather than later in my career that there are more voices, not just at the table, but communities of color and rural communities, like having an active voice in decision making. So it's something that I think we see the beginnings of, and I hope will continue to grow. So just to talk very generally about New Mexico and the Rio Grande Basin. Oh, sorry, one thing I want to mention. I've been on another meeting since 8 o'clock this morning, and I'm kind of zooming in here during my lunch hour, and both of my dogs have been silent that entire time, and I'm quite sure that now that my microphone is on, one or the other of them will start barking. So I apologize for that ahead of time. So on average in New Mexico, temperatures have risen 3 degrees since the 1970s. And as all of you know, there are all kinds of impacts that are tied into this warming. In the arid Southwest, warming is drying. So we see a drying out, not just of our surface waters, our rivers and reservoirs and lakes, but we see additional pressures on groundwater as people turn to groundwater to supplement those dwindling surface supplies. We see, farmlands and ranchlands that are parched that take longer to recover from dry periods because it's warmer. So the soil moisture is something that many in this community talk about regularly, but among sort of general members of the public, kind of talk about drought in terms of the precipitation that's falling, not necessarily in terms of how that might or might not change soil moisture over time. So we see our forests drying, which leads to all other sorts of problems, like a longer wildfire season and bigger wildfires, and then post-wildfire flooding and changes in ecosystems and habitat. So we see this 3 degrees of warming since the 1970s is already having impacts on water, forests, communities, the economy, culture, and I would argue mental health, people's, you don't have to be a farmer to feel devastated emotionally by drought. There are degrees of challenges and sort of the economic impacts. But I think that in the 20 years that I've been writing about climate change, I think one of the things that we don't talk about often enough is what it feels like to be a part of this changing world and to see our landscapes changing and to see ways of life having to change because of these landscape level, ecosystem level, economic level changes. And I also think there are a lot of things that we don't talk about in terms of how these changes affect our relationships with one another, with other communities, with these landscapes, with the Rio Grande, how we see our rivers, and how we think about their futures and how future generations will relate to them, which they will relate to them in an entirely different way from how we have and from how generations before us have. And so I think one of the things that's really important to talk about, or at least think about quietly to ourselves sometimes, is how these changes and how our relationships with something like the Rio Grande, as we see its waters diminish, as we see its flows change, as we grapple with these challenges, what that means in terms of our understanding of what a river is and what its future holds, and what that river has a right to be outside of how we rely upon it. So I'm just going to share my screen real quickly, and it's going to be a mess for a second. And some of these things so many of you already understand. And so let's see, I always mess this up at first. Sorry about that. And so what I'm going to do real quick is, we already know about how dry things are. So in New Mexico, and hopefully you can see my screen. In New Mexico right now, we have El Vado is being emptied because there's going to be dam construction, but you can see how low Heron is, how low El Vado is. Abiquiu, gosh, it just looks like it's just full to the brim because we're so used to seeing it low, but 45% of capacity is not a great thing. Looking onto the main stem of the Rio Grande, Elephant Butte at 11% full, Caballo at 7% full. Surely we'll see those numbers bump up with some spring snow melt, which I'll get to in a second. But I'm already hearing that in southern New Mexico and Texas, irrigation season is anticipated to be very, 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 very short compared to normal years, and also starting very late. So just to look a little bit more closely at Elephant Butte, which is obviously hugely important for New Mexico and Texas, to see sort of the historical ebbs and flows of the reservoir's levels. And here in New Mexico, we have this very stark reminder of what climate change looks like on the Rio Grande, and how our past infrastructure and our past expectations of what the river was and what the climate was sort of play out in challenging ways today. In the early 20th century, it likely made sense to put the reservoir where it was. Today, to have the state's largest reservoir and an increasingly warm the hottest part of the state, one of the warmest parts of the state that's seeing accelerated warming, is an infrastructure challenge that we're going to have to really grapple with and decide how we think about our infrastructure and how we think about our future. Like I said, as a reporter, I've been covering water issues in New Mexico since 2002. And while there are so many smart and thoughtful and good people working on water in New Mexico, and there are a handful of politicians who understand the challenges and the urgency, New Mexico, in my opinion, is doing not even just not enough, not even close to enough when it comes to really honestly addressing the water challenges in the state, and specifically on the Rio Grande. Listening to Senator Simpson talk about the legislation introduced in Colorado, I mean, honestly, I thought, oh shoot, I better leave this symposium right now because the situation in New Mexico is very different. That's not to say many people don't understand the challenges and are not working and doing heartbreaking, difficult work around water challenges. I don't want to diminish the work that's being done. Not enough people are doing it, and not enough lawmakers in the state are doing it. We just finished up a 30-day session that was as disappointing as a legislative session could be in terms of water planning and environmental issues and climate change, where the legislature could kind of barely be motivated enough to put money toward environmental agencies and regulation and compliance, and specifically the water agencies. Never mind to be talking about something like water transactions or water planning. I think we have a climate crisis in New Mexico, but more frightening to me is we have a political crisis, and we have a crisis of inaction and unwillingness to act on water and climate. And I know I'm like super gloom and doom lady, but I think it's really important for us to really talk about that. There are hard conversations that we need to be having around every single thing that involves water in the state. I'm working on a story right now about weather modification. And what, that's really interesting. I know lots of other states like Utah and California have done weather modification for years. I'm not sure what the state of that is in the upper part of the Rio Grande Basin, but great. Okay, let's look at all the tools in the toolbox. But while working on the story, I learned that summer seeding operations, when they're done under the exact right conditions, can yield a 10 to 15% bump in precipitation over 4 to 6 months. That indicates to me that we are at a point where we are willing to take any little chance for some rain to fall in parts of the state. This particular project is looking over in eastern New Mexico, so outside of the Rio Grande Basin. But it indicates to me how desperate we are, how willing we are to take, slight chances. And true, these aren't huge investments. These aren't huge financial investments to try this and to do this. And I would hope that we're also willing to start making more chances in how we think about the big pieces, the infrastructure, water use, planning for the future. And I think that we need to really be asking ourselves these bigger questions about how we're going to live and continue to live in this new world. Are we going to, we know the world is changing. What are we going to do besides worry about it, or besides fight about it, besides dig our heels in deeper and protect our own interests and not worry about downstream users or users who don't look like us or agree with us. I think this is a terribly critical moment in our history, not just because of every single thing we see happening in the news right now, whether it's a pandemic or wars breaking out or hurricanes or tornadoes in December. And I think that we have a unique opportunity right now to really decide how we as a species, how we as neighbors, how we as communities are going to work together and move as gracefully as we can into a future that's quite daunting and quite challenging. And so even though I write about sort of these bad news things all the time, I have increasingly become filled with a sense of urgent hopefulness that through conversations like the ones you're having here today and the ones that brought you here today, that we can think about long-term survival of our communities and also of our beautiful river that I believe has a right to be here regardless of how it serves us. And then I just wanted to mention one last thing, is that conversations around water must also include conversations about energy and greenhouse gas emissions. The two cannot be siloed any longer. The IPCC report that came out in August showed lots of really great information about how rising greenhouse gas emissions affect temperature change. And it was the first time I had seen in one of these reports where they were actually quantifying and showing in graphs the direct correlation between a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions and the amount of temperature rise. And that's really, really important when we're talking about water. We know that climate change is affecting our water supplies, and we know why the climate is changing. And in that report, there's something else that's really critical, because I think that it's challenging enough to talk about climate change and water. When you also talk about energy and economic diversification, it's totally overwhelming. But humans are adaptable and smart. We can have all of these conversations, because what that report in August showed, which isn't talked about as much, is that as soon as emissions are cut to zero, temperature rise can stop within as little as 3 years. In the past, we've talked a lot about how there's a certain amount of warming that's baked into the system, that because we've released these greenhouse gas emissions over a century now, that the warming is baked in, that warming is going to continue regardless of even if we stop. So that's often been an excuse. Well, we can't talk about stopping greenhouse gas emissions now. Climate change is going to happen anyway. And what this report did was really put a fine point on the fact that we can actually affect change in the very short term if we're willing to do that. So I would encourage people, even though you're overwhelmed with water issues already, that we cannot continue to talk about energy and water in separate conversations anymore. There's another IPCC report that's coming out on Monday that journalists will certainly cover. I'm definitely interested in seeing what's in this most recent report and helping people understand kind of how that translates to our neck of the woods. So again, thank you for having me here today. Thank you for the important conversations you're having. I'm going to drop some links into the chat so you can find those various reservoir and stream gauges, which I did not show you, but anyway, I'll drop all those links into the chat so that you all can have them handy if you want to see them.
Perfect, Laura. Thank you so much for all of that. And There are many, there is significant overlap between several of these topics. None of these topics are managed, are focused on in isolation. And I think we have to see where the overlap is and where those conversations do come together. Ones that are very important, ones that are going to have different perspectives, ones that are have different thoughts. We all come with a different lens. You started off in talking about that you don't have to be a farmer or a rancher to truly appreciate the impact of drought. And I think sometimes we get caught up looking only through our own lens, that it's only impacting us, and we don't see some of the peripheral impacts that happen as well. So thank you, Laura. Appreciate your diverse nature and thoughts that help offer a different lens that we can all look through and see if we might be able to see something a little bit different that maybe we haven't thought about before. And we definitely need that on a regular basis. So thank you so much. Definitely appreciate it, and definitely appreciate all of the links. And definitely please look at some of Laura's writings that she has on the issue, because it's a full spectrum of different types of topics and information that we need to bring into this dialogue if we're truly going to represent it and truly going to engage it on a holistic basis. And I think that's very important.